What if everything you believe is just a passing perspective? What if you're dreaming right now, and you'll only wake up when you stop believing there's a you at all? Over 2,000 years ago, a man laughed at absolute truths, mocked logic, refused fame and power, and dove into something greater than any system, the Tao. He believed reality is unstable, that wisdom comes from letting go, and that only those who forget themselves can truly live. Today, you'll meet Zhuangzi, the philosopher of the butterfly, the paradox, and freedom itself. This is the story and philosophy of a thinker who questioned everything, even his own identity. Imagine living in a world where stability was just an illusion, where every state saw its neighbors as enemies, and war was part of daily life, not only on the battlefield, but also in the realm of ideas. That was China in the 4th century BCE, during what is known as the Warring States period. It was in this harsh landscape, filled with sharpened swords and fierce debates, that one of the freest and deepest thinkers in history emerged, Zhuangzi. Little is known for certain about his life. Zhuangzi, or Chuang Tzu, as his name is sometimes written, is believed to have been born around 369 BCE in the region of Meng, within the state of Song, one of the small kingdoms constantly clashing with its neighbors. And it was precisely this atmosphere of political instability, rivalry among states, and the collapse of ancient traditions that shaped the spirit of his philosophy. A profound rejection of all forms of rigidity, whether political, moral, or conceptual. The Warring States period, roughly 475 to 221 BCE, was a time of radical transformation. The old ideals of the Zhou dynasty were fading. The feudal system had fractured, giving rise to intense competition among about 7 major kingdoms. Kings declared themselves absolute rulers. War became constant. Yet, paradoxically, this violent time also became one of the richest eras in human thought, later remembered by the Chinese as the age of the 100 schools of thought. It was the time of Confucius, Mozi, Mencius, Laozi, and many others. Ideas were weapons. Philosophers traveled from court to court, offering political advice, moral codes, theories about nature, and even military strategies. Scholars tried to reshape society through strict systems of duties, rituals, hierarchies, and laws. Everyone sought to restore order, each in their own way. Zhuangzi, however, refused to play that game entirely. Unlike most thinkers who tried to win favor in royal courts, Zhuangzi rejected all official positions. It's said that he was once invited to serve as a high-ranking official in the court of the King of Chu, one of the most powerful states at the time. His answer became legendary. He compared himself to a sacred turtle, dead and wrapped in silk, preserved in a temple, and he asked, "Would that turtle rather be dead and honored, or alive, dragging its tail through the mud?" Then he concluded, "I'd rather drag my tail through the mud." That refusal of power, prestige, and fame wasn't an act of pride. It was an expression of his philosophy itself. Inner freedom is worth more than any external glory. In a world that tried to fit people into fixed molds, roles, titles, social hierarchies, Zhuangzi taught the opposite: detachment, spontaneity, and harmony with the natural flow of life, the Tao. But to truly grasp the depth of this stance, we need to understand the world around him. The political chaos of that time was more than external disorder. It mirrored a deep conflict between worldviews. Confucianism, for example, sought to restore order through ritual, morality, and respect for hierarchy. For Confucius, harmony came from reviving ancient traditions and cultivating the virtues of the Zhuangzi, the noble man. It demanded discipline, study, and obedience. The Confucian world was structured, predictable, built on clear duties and social norms. Zhuangzi saw in that a subtle kind of prison, an attempt to force life, fluid and ever-changing, into a fixed frame. He didn't see society as something to be controlled from the top down. On the contrary, he believed that the very effort to impose order was the root of human suffering. In trying to control everything, people lose touch with the natural flow of existence, the Tao. But Zhuangzi wasn't alone in criticizing rigid systems of thought. There was also Mohism, founded by Mozi, which promoted a utilitarian morality based on universal love and functional social order. The Mohists believed a good government should be technocratic, merit-based, and focused on practical results. Efficient, yes, but still deeply structured. Zhuangzi mocked such ideas with sharp humor and paradoxes. For him, technical knowledge, moral programming, and rigid systems were as absurd as trying to teach a fish how to fly. The world doesn't fit into absolute categories, and neither does life. So he laughed at scholars, teased bureaucrats, and disarmed logicians with strange parables that sounded like nonsense, but carried deep wisdom. Unlike other masters, Zhuangzi didn't try to save civilization or design political models. His goal was to liberate the human being from what enslaves the mind: fear, desire, identity, judgment. The more society sought control, political, moral, or military, the more he saw the need to let go. That's the great irony. In one of China's most violent and rigid eras, a philosophy was born that didn't seek to conquer chaos, but to live in harmony with it. Zhuangzi wasn't a political revolutionary. He was a revolutionary of consciousness. That's remarkable considering the time he lived in, when philosophers were often used as tools of power. Many were hired to educate rulers, train administrators, or strengthen the state. Zhuangzi refused that role. He didn't want to produce obedient scholars for an empire. He wanted to free minds from the illusion of control. Still, his withdrawal from politics wasn't escapism. He clearly understood the pain of his time: war, tyranny, and human suffering, and saw that the root of it all was separation from the Tao. His philosophy wasn't about fleeing the world, but reconnecting with the living essence of reality, beyond power, beyond appearances. And maybe that's why Zhuangzi still speaks to us today. How often do we get trapped in roles, ambitions, and routines that make us lose ourselves? How often does success demand that we sacrifice our spontaneity? In many ways, our world isn't that different from his, full of noise, competition, and control. That's why his words still echo so powerfully. Zhuangzi's legacy lies not only in what he taught, but in how he lived. His rejection of fame, his independence, his simplicity, they weren't just ideas, but a way of being. He lived what he taught, and taught by living. His book, The Zhuangzi, isn't a rigid treatise. It's a collection of stories, paradoxes, dreams, and provocations. And that literary style fits his message perfectly. It's not about giving absolute answers, but about opening space for wonder, laughter, and freedom. Zhuangzi may have been the first true philosopher of inner freedom, born in a time of outer tyranny. His life shows that even amid chaos, it's possible to find a path that doesn't bow to systems, doesn't sell itself to power, and doesn't cling to identity. He taught that there's a freedom that doesn't depend on governments or titles, a freedom born from letting go and trusting the invisible flow of existence. That was his answer to chaos, not a system, but a smile, not a theory, but a flight. In the darkness and moral confusion of ancient China, Zhuangzi didn't appear as a reformer or a lawmaker of reason. He appeared as a liberator of the mind. His philosophy, as fluid as a mountain stream, is a dive into freedom. Not the freedom limited by logic or morality, but one that dissolves boundaries, melts certainties, and invites us to live in harmony with the mystery of existence. Zhuangzi, along with Laozi, is one of the two great figures of philosophical Taoism, Daojia, but there's an important distinction. While Laozi, in the Tao Te Ching, speaks in solemn, almost prophetic tones and seeks universal principles about the Tao and its relation to governance and ethics, Zhuangzi goes further. He doesn't want to shape the world. He wants to dismantle it, laughing at those who try to force fixed forms on what is, by nature, formless and ever-changing. And that's exactly why Zhuangzi became one of the most powerful critics of philosophical rigidity in his time, especially against Confucianism and rationalist schools like Mohism and the School of Names. The Silent Rebellion, Taoism versus Confucianism. For Zhuangzi, The moral rigidity of Confucianism was a subtle form of violence. Confucians saw human beings as needing to be shaped, disciplined and civilized through moral lessons, social rituals, and hierarchies. In other words, humanity was a project to be completed by culture. Zhuangzi saw that as a betrayal of our nature, an attempt to domesticate what is wild, free, and spontaneous. He said, "The world cannot be conquered by force, and the sage does not try to make it obey, for whatever is molded loses its nature." To Zhuangzi, every attempt to impose a universal morality or fixed rule on life only pulls people further away from the Tao. The Tao, he said, can't be captured in words or concepts. It's silent, invisible, and nameless. It can only be lived, not defined. So when the Confucians spoke of virtue, he replied with absurd stories. When they praised obedience or loyalty, he answered with metaphors that made those virtues crumble. To him, any morality imposed from outside was a prison. True virtue was born from inner emptiness, spontaneity, and harmony with the Tao, not from obedience. Critique of rationalism and technical knowledge. Another hallmark of Zhuangzi's thought is his deep skepticism toward logical reasoning. In a time when schools like Mohism built moral systems on calculations of utility, and logicians like Hui Shi obsessed over linguistic puzzles, Zhuangzi simply laughed, and his laughter was philosophical. He saw that all attempts to capture reality with words and definitions were like trying to catch the wind with a net. He wrote, "A word is not an empty sound. It says something. But what it says is not fixed. So we have words, but they are not stable. Can we really speak of the Tao with words?" For Zhuangzi, logical or technical knowledge is limited because it divides and categorizes, while reality itself is fluid, beyond opposites like right-wrong, good-evil, useful, useless. Those are mental constructions, not truths of nature. He even questioned whether we can ever know anything with certainty. His philosophy was a call to liberating doubt, not the kind that paralyzes, but the kind that frees us from false certainties. The philosophy of laughter and dream Zhuangzi didn't write in formulas, he told stories, and his stories are full of paradox, humor, and absurdity. He used metaphor and irony to break the reader's mental patterns. His goal wasn't to teach doctrine, but to unteach illusions. One famous tale describes a giant fish called Kun transforming into a massive bird named Peng. It's not meant as a moral lesson, but as an invitation to expand perspective, to realize that what seems impossible might only be beyond our limited view. That same spirit appears in the famous butterfly dream. "Once, I dreamt I was a butterfly, fluttering freely. Then I awoke, and now I wonder, am I Zhuangzi dreaming I'm a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming I'm Zhuangzi?" It's more than poetic doubt. It's a dismantling of the illusion of fixed identity. Reality and dream, subject and object, are inseparable flows. The self isn't fixed, it's movement. Accepting that isn't losing yourself, it's freedom. A philosophy of detachment and spontaneity. Unlike those who tried to mold the world through systems and doctrines, Zhuangzi taught Wu Wei, effortless action, pure spontaneity. But it's not laziness, it's freedom born from detachment, from letting go of the ego, the fixed I, and surrendering to the natural flow of life. He believed that only when we stop trying to control everything can we truly live in harmony with reality. Like water flowing between rocks, the wise don't resist, they move with life. This can't be learned from books or formulas, it must be lived. Skepticism, freedom, and radical critique. Zhuangzi was a liberating skeptic. He didn't just question reason or morality, he questioned the very structure of thought. Every time we think, he said, we divide reality into artificial categories. To be free, we must unlearn. Great wisdom looks like foolishness. Great eloquence sounds like stuttering. These paradoxes aren't nonsense. They're keys. True wisdom doesn't explain everything. It accepts not knowing. And in that acceptance, in silence, arises the most radical freedom, to be nothing, and therefore to be everything. Zhuangzi embodies the living heart of Taoism. While others tried to build systems to save the world, he invites us to let go of the world and of ourselves. His philosophy isn't a doctrine, it's a state of being, a way of disappearing into the flow of existence and discovering what has always been beyond words. To understand Zhuangzi's philosophy, we first need to dive into the quiet, mysterious river that flows beneath all his ideas, the Tao, or the way. But the Tao is not a road with signs. It's not a doctrine with rules. It's more like the wind, invisible, yet always present. Like water, soft, yet unstoppable. It's the foundation of everything, but it escapes any form we try to give it. Zhuangzi's concept of the Tao has its deepest roots in an earlier text, the famous Tao Te Ching, attributed to Laozi, Lao Tzu. Laozi was a legendary figure, probably from the 6th century BCE, though some scholars place him later, around the 5th or 4th century BCE. His short text, about 5,000 characters, became the foundation of Taoist thought. But if the Tao Te Ching was the seed, the Zhuangzi was the wild, untamed, poetic and provocative flower that grew from it. Zhuangzi inherited the heart of Laozi's philosophy, but walked in a different direction, in tone, style, and depth. He didn't just repeat Laozi's brief, mysterious sayings. He expanded them with stories, paradoxes, strange characters, and dreamlike visions that dissolve the line between the real and the imagined. For both Laozi and Zhuangzi, the Tao is before all things, before existence, before names, before distinctions. But while Laozi sometimes tried to guide rulers on how to apply the Tao to politics and society, Zhuangzi freed it completely from any practical or moral use. Instead of treating the Tao as a tool, he saw it as a living experience, something to inhabit, not to control. From Laozi's silence to Zhuangzi's laughter, in the Tao Te Ching, Laozi opens with a line that defines the entire Taoist tradition. The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. That single phrase sets the tone. The true way can't be expressed in words. Language divides, labels, and limits, while the Tao is unified, flowing, and beyond concepts. Laozi delivers his message like a whisper to the wind, minimal, poetic, profound. Zhuangzi takes that same essence and turns it into a dance. Instead of short, solemn verses, he writes surreal dialogues, playful parables, and humorous exchanges that look absurd at first, but reveal deep truths about our endless attempts to capture the ineffable. A classic example is his dialogue with Hui Shi about whether fish are happy. The exchange spirals into irony and wordplay until it collapses into laughter. The message isn't about fish, it's about the impossibility of reaching ultimate truth through logic. The Tao lies beyond it. Zhuangzi honors Laozi, but never imitates him. He understands that the Tao can't be described, so he invents a language that points to it without trapping it. His choice of humor, lightness, and imagination isn't accidental. It's his way of escaping the prison of words. If Laozi whispers, Zhuangzi laughs. But both are pointing to the same infinite mystery, Zhuangzi and the spirit of the 100 schools of thought. When Zhuangzi wrote, China was alive with philosophical competition. This period, known as the 100 schools of thought, was one of the most intellectually vibrant eras in Chinese history. Philosophers traveled from court to court, offering political theories, ethical systems, and models of governance. The Tao Te Ching was already well known at the time, admired for its mystical depth. Some read it as a spiritual guide, others tried to use its ideas in politics, as an alternative to the authoritarian legalists or the rigid morality of the Confucian. But Zhuangzi saw danger in that. He realized that even the Tao was at risk of being turned into a tool, controlled, moralized, or institutionalized, so he rebelled. His response was radical. He stripped the Tao of all utility. He showed that the true Tao can only be experienced once we let go of usefulness, purpose, and control. That's what makes his work revolutionary. Zhuangzi removed the Tao from politics, theology, and moral systems, and placed it in the realm of direct experience. The Tao, for him, was not to be studied or applied, but lived, not accumulated like knowledge, but dissolved into as being itself. Zhuangzi's original vision, the Tao as continuous transformation. One of the key differences between Laozi and Zhuangzi lies in Zhuangzi's emphasis on transformation, Bayan. For him, the Tao isn't just the origin of the world. It is the endless process of becoming, changing, and transforming that runs through all things. Birth and death, growth and decay, ideas and identities. Because of that, Zhuangzi's philosophy breaks with all ideas of permanence. Nothing is fixed, nothing is final, not even the self. The wise person doesn't cling to stability or identity, but flows with the constant movement of existence. He wrote, "The perfect person is like a mirror. They retain nothing, expect nothing, and seek nothing. They reflect everything, but do not interfere." That perfect person lives in harmony with the Tao, not by understanding it, but by stopping resistance. While Laozi still outlined moral guidelines based on the Tao, Zhuangzi went further. He let even those go. He wanted us to be like hollow bamboo, or the wind that passes freely. No attachment, no direction, no ego. Why Zhuangzi chose a playful, storytelling style? There's a reason Zhuangzi chose to express philosophy through humor, stories, and paradox. He knew that trying to describe the Tao directly would only create contradictions. How can you talk about the nameless without naming it? How can you teach non-duality using dualistic language? His answer was play. He invented tales where fish speak, men become butterflies, sages laugh with skeletons, and truths contradict themselves. The absurdity wasn't random. It was a method to awaken perception beyond reason. Zhuangzi turned philosophy into an art form. He didn't argue, he enchanted. His poetic language opens doors logic cannot. The Tao, like the scent of incense or morning dew, can't be grasped, only felt. The Tao as freedom from form. Zhuangzi marks a turning point in Chinese thought. He expanded the idea of the Tao beyond Laozi's foundational vision. His goal wasn't to systematize the ineffable, it was to free it. His light, playful writing serves a single purpose: to free the human spirit from form, certainty, and convention. In Laozi's work, the Tao is the path to be followed. In Zhuangzi's, the Tao is the flight itself, a flight without destination, without map, without return. It doesn't ask, where am I going, but how can I dance with the wind? For Zhuangzi, the deepest truth of existence can't be taught or captured by words. The Tao isn't something to master, it's something to live. Infinite, silent, and unseen, it's present in all things, and beyond them all. From the very beginning of his work, Zhuangzi insists, the Tao is beyond language. Any attempt to name it or control it only takes us further from it. Words, logic, judgment, desire, these are tools of the ego trying to frame what has no frame. He wrote, "The Tao has no form. Its presence is emptiness. It does nothing, yet through it, everything is done. You can't hold water in your hands, and you can't grasp the Tao with the mind." For Zhuangzi, the great mistake of philosophy, especially the moral and rationalist schools of his time, was trying to define reality, to divide it into categories, and then build a truth upon those divisions. That truth, he said, is artificial, a mental construction, not an experience of what's real. Zhuangzi's critique was sharp. He saw scholars, politicians, and moralists as obsessed with control, afraid to surrender to what cannot be understood. While they tried to impose order, Zhuangzi learned to dance with chaos. The Tao cannot be named. Zhuangzi's entire philosophy revolves around breaking language apart as a path to truth. The moment we name something, we create separation. This is good. That is bad. This is real. That is illusion. But these divisions don't exist in nature, only in the human mind. That's why Zhuangzi used paradoxes and strange stories. He didn't try to explain the Tao. He performed the collapse of explanation itself. He wanted readers to feel, in their own frustration, the limits of thought. And in that silence beyond thought, maybe glimpse the Tao. He wrote, "Words are like nets used to catch fish. Once the fish is caught, forget the net. Where is the person who has forgotten words, so I can talk with them?" The point is clear. Words are bridges, not destinations. Cling to them, and you lose the mystery. Cling to form, and you miss the essence. For Zhuangzi, wisdom comes not from accumulating knowledge, but from letting go. Not from knowing more, but from needing less. To live in harmony with the Tao, we must empty ourselves of ego, of judgment, of desire. He wrote, "The perfect person has no self. The spiritual person has no achievement. The wise person has no name." These lines, poetic and radical, describe an ontology of emptiness. The self is not a fixed substance. It's a temporary construction. Name, status, knowledge. They're clothes we must eventually take off to feel the freshness of the Tao. Zhuangzi invites us to a profound humility, to recognize that we are not masters of the world, or even of ourselves. Life is like a branch carried by the current. To resist is futile and painful. The only true wisdom is to flow with existence, lightly and without fear. Spontaneity as the highest wisdom. If the Tao can't be understood by reason, it can still be lived through spontaneity. The Chinese word for this is ziran, meaning so of itself or naturally so. It's what happens effortlessly, like a flower blooming or a bird taking flight. Zhuangzi saw nature as the purest expression of the Tao, not because it's good or beautiful by human standards, but because it simply is. The bamboo doesn't wish to be an oak. The fish doesn't wish to fly. Everything follows its own course in silent harmony. That's what Zhuangzi sought. A life free from the ego's control, from comparison and ambition. A life of radical trust in the natural flow. He called this wu wei, or non-action. Not passivity, but action without effort, where the self and the world move as one. The wise person, he said, is like a musician who plays without thinking of the notes, dancing with life as the river dances with stones. They don't resist. They don't force. They simply are. The Tao, not a thing, but a way of being. For Zhuangzi, the Tao is not a deity, a substance, or an external force. It's not dualistic. It's the way the universe happens, an ongoing process, a living rhythm. Following the Tao doesn't mean obeying rules or worshipping an invisible power. It means tuning yourself to the frequency of life. Like a flute aligning with the wind, it's living lightly, without resistance or attachment, knowing that everything changes, everything passes, everything connects. This wisdom doesn't come from outside, not from books or temples, but from within, when the ego finally falls silent. The Tao, as an invitation to inner silence, Zhuangzi doesn't give us answers. He frees us from the need for them. He wants us to let go of the mental categories that keep us trapped in artificial living. His philosophy is an invitation to inner silence, not the absence of sound, but the absence of ego. In that silence, the Tao reveals itself, not as a mystical vision, but as a gentle clarity that moves through all things. In that state, there's no separation between self and world. Everything flows together. Zhuangzi teaches that there is no path to the Tao. The Tao is the path itself, walked only when we stop trying to reach somewhere else. It doesn't demand faith, obedience, or sacrifice. Only that we stop resisting what already is. Let go of the names, the roles, the ambitions, the truths, because the Tao is always here, silent, vast, indifferent, and compassionate at once. And when we finally stop trying to control it, we discover that we were never apart from it. In the philosophical world of ancient China, few thinkers were as daring as Zhuangzi. At a time when philosophers competed to define what was good and evil, right and wrong, virtuous and corrupt, each with their own formulas and moral systems, Zhuangzi chose to laugh at them all. He wasn't trying to decide what was right or wrong. He was questioning whether such things could even be fixed in the first place. This is one of the most revolutionary traits of his thought, a philosophy of radical relativity, one that shakes certainty and opens space for multiple ways of seeing and living in the world. To understand the historical weight of this, we need to look at the time Zhuangzi lived in, the turbulent, vibrant Warring States period, around 475–221 BCE. It was an age not only of endless wars between rival Chinese states, but also of an intellectual explosion, a golden age of philosophical schools competing for influence among rulers. Among the most powerful schools was Confucianism, which had become the moral and social backbone of the time. Confucian scholars believed the world could and should be ordered through ethics, discipline, and hierarchy. For them, harmony came from universal, unchanging values such as filial piety, loyalty, honesty, and respect for rituals. Confucianism assumed there was an objective truth about what was right, and it was the duty of the wise to live according to it. The ideal person, the Zhuangzi, was one who followed moral order, practiced rituals, and served as a model for others. Social harmony, they said, depended on everyone playing their role correctly. The father as father, the son as son, the ruler as ruler. But Zhuangzi saw this as a dangerous illusion. How could one system define how everyone should live? How could one truth fit all beings, all places, all times? For him, trying to standardize reality wasn't just naive, it was violent. It suffocated life's diversity, ignored human complexity, and reduced the living world to abstract categories that existed more in people's minds than in nature itself. Zhuangzi responded with something bold. Nothing is absolute. Everything depends on perspective. Right and wrong, useful and useless, high and low, all depend on who's looking, from where, and under what conditions. This kind of relativity isn't moral chaos. It's an invitation to humility. It's the awareness that every being sees the world from a unique point of view, and that no single perspective can claim to judge them all. Breaking opposites, dismantling fixed dualisms. This idea was a radical break from the rest of Chinese philosophy. Rival schools, especially Confucianism and Mohism, relied on rigid opposites: right, wrong, wise, ignorant, good, bad. Zhuangzi tore those apart, showing they weren't part of nature at all but human constructions, products of time, culture, and circumstance. He used parables to make his point. In one story, a man looks at a crooked, twisted tree and calls it useless. It can't be used to build anything. But another man points out that its very uselessness is what kept it alive. No one ever cut it down. What looked like a flaw was actually its gift, survival. The story isn't about trees. It's about perspective. What seems useless to one can be precious to another. What looks like weakness from one angle can be strength from another. Reality shifts depending on where you stand. Zhuangzi versus Confucianism. A clash of worldviews. The clash between Zhuangzi and the Confucians wasn't just moral, it was existential. While Confucius taught that order comes from fulfilling one's social role properly, Zhuangzi saw those roles as traps. Labeling behavior as appropriate or inappropriate means forgetting that life itself is spontaneous, diverse, and unpredictable. He rejected the idea of a universal moral essence. Morality, he said, was a human invention, an attempt to impose order on a world that is, by nature, fluid and ever-changing. In this chaos, nothing stays still, not even the self. Zhuangzi once asked, "How do I know that what I call right isn't really wrong? How do I know that what I call wrong isn't really right?" It's not a rhetorical question. It's a warning. Certainty is fragile. If everything depends on perspective, then wisdom isn't about judging. It's about recognizing the limits of your own judgment. Relativity as a critique of ego and anthropocentrism. Zhuangzi's philosophy of relativity also challenged the idea that humans are the measure of all things. He often used animals and fantastical creatures in his stories to show that every being has its own Tao, its own way of existing, and that humans have no right to treat their view as universal truth. In one famous parable, a frog living at the bottom of a well laughs at a sea turtle who visits him because he can't imagine a world larger than his own tiny hole. The turtle describes the vast ocean, but the frog simply can't understand. The lesson is simple. Each being's horizon is limited by its own world. Judging everything from inside your own well is arrogance disguised as wisdom. This critique of ego and human-centered thinking reinforced Zhuangzi's core idea. No one holds absolute truth. Every creature sees the world differently. Wisdom means embracing that diversity, not erasing it. In an age of ideological conflict, his message was disarming. While others built rigid systems, he questioned the need for any system at all. While others tried to order the world from above, he invited us to look from within, with flexibility, humility, and laughter. The butterfly and the awakening. Perhaps the most famous expression of Zhuangzi's relativity comes from his dream. Once, I dreamed I was a butterfly, fluttering about, not knowing I was Zhuangzi. Then I awoke, and now I don't know. Am I Zhuangzi who dreamed of being a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming of being Zhuangzi? It's not just a poetic thought, it's a philosophical earthquake. What is real? What is identity? Zhuangzi reminds us that our sense of self and truth depend entirely on perspective. The dream is real to the dreamer. Waking life might just be another kind of dream. The story isn't about confusion, it's about liberation. It invites us to let go of our need for certainty. This is right. This is wrong. This is me. These statements, he says, are fragile and temporary. Dismantling dualisms. For Zhuangzi, the categories we use to understand the world are human inventions, and therefore limited. Language loves opposites: good, evil, high, low, gain, loss. But nature doesn't work that way. The mind divides, yet reality flows. He wrote, "What is high? What is low? What is right? What is wrong? From the view of the Tao, all things merge into one." Here he strikes at the root of dogmatism, the belief that there's a single, eternal standard for truth. But in lived experience, no such line exists. What is poison to one may be medicine to another. What is shame in one culture may be honor in another. Zhuangzi's ethics weren't based on rigid rules, but on openness and adaptability. He didn't say anything goes. He said, "No truth lasts forever." Critique of dogmatism. Dogmatism, for Zhuangzi, is a kind of blindness, the obsession with one perspective as if it were universal. This isn't just a philosophical mistake, it's a spiritual disease. When we think there's only one right way, we become rigid, intolerant, and controlling. From that come unjust laws, ideological wars, and the suppression of difference. He saw this rigidity everywhere in his time, in Confucians obsessed with ritual and moral order, and in Mohists pushing a rational system of universal love. Both thought they had the answer. For Zhuangzi, both were wrong because they refused to see life's plurality. His response? Don't try to control the world with formulas. Learn to move with its changes. Uselessness as freedom. One of his most subtle parables tells of a tree so twisted and deformed that no carpenter would ever cut it down. It was useless, and that uselessness kept it alive. For Zhuangzi, this was the ultimate irony. What society rejects as worthless might actually be the key to freedom. Usefulness, he said, is a human illusion. What's useful to one may be meaningless to another. The crooked tree that can't become furniture becomes shade for travelers, a home for birds, and a symbol of peace. The lesson: when you stop living by others' standards of value, you find a quiet kind of freedom. Perspective as wisdom Zhuangzi's relativism isn't born from despair, but from compassion. If everything depends on point of view, then wisdom means listening, not arguing. True understanding isn't about having more knowledge than others, but realizing that your knowledge is just one among many. He wrote, "You have your way of seeing things, I have mine, but who are we to say which is right?" That humility is revolutionary. Instead of imposing beliefs, Zhuangzi opens space for dialogue. Instead of clinging to ego, he invites us to live lightly, to stop needing to win or to be right. It's a philosophy of inner peace, not conflict, living without needing to be right. Zhuangzi's philosophy of relativity is, above all, a philosophy of peace. In a world still divided by opinions and ideologies, his message echoes quietly. You don't need to be right to live in harmony. He teaches that the obsession with absolute truth feeds vanity and violence. When we let go of that need, we become freer to listen, to change, to grow. We move closer to nature, where nothing is fixed and everything adapts. To live by the Tao is to accept that life is movement. It's to stop demanding that the world bend to our view and allow our view to bend to the mystery of the world. Zhuangzi didn't give us a system of rules. He gave us a mirror that laughs at our seriousness, reflects our certainties back as questions, and invites us to dance with impermanence. Everything is relative, but that's not cynicism. It's an invitation to listen, to be humble, to be light, because only when we stop demanding that life be what we want, we finally begin to see it as it truly is. During the Warring States period, China wasn't only torn apart by political and military conflict, it was also living through one of the most intense intellectual eras in human history. Amid wars, diplomacy, and shifting borders, another battle was unfolding: the war of ideas. Philosophical schools competed fiercely for followers and for influence in royal courts. Scholars, advisors, and teachers tried to persuade rulers that their moral or rational systems held the key to restoring order in a chaotic world. Two schools dominated that battlefield: Confucianism and Mohism. Both believed in the power of reason, but in very different ways. Confucianism, founded by Confucius, defended moral rationality as the foundation of social stability. A Confucian believed that harmony could only exist when each person fulfilled their role with virtue, wisdom, and discipline. Virtue wasn't spontaneous. It had to be learned, practiced, and passed on. Rituals, family duties, and respect for hierarchy were all part of a rational moral system, preserved through texts, teachers, and tradition. Mohism, led by Mozi, went even further into rationalism. Mozi argued that morality should be based on objective, measurable principles. He preached Jian-ai, impartial universal love, and criticized rituals as wasteful. He wanted a government guided by practical utility, efficiency, and economic moderation. In many ways, Mohism was an early form of Chinese utilitarianism. For the Mohists, reason was the ultimate tool, the standard by which everything, even emotion, should be judged. Both systems shared one assumption: that the world could and should be ruled by reason, that the human mind could define laws, principles, and values that would bring order to life. That civilization was the triumph of logic over the chaos of nature. It was precisely this faith in reason, this attempt to force the world to obey logic, that Zhuangzi rebelled against. The Taoist, who rejected the empire of the mind, Zhuangzi looked around and saw a world trying to control itself with ideas, a world where wisdom meant turning human behavior into equations, where morality was reduced to formulas and moral checklists. But life, as he experienced it, didn't fit on charts or in treatises. Life was unstable, fluid, and paradoxical, and every attempt to rationalize it was, for him, a subtle kind of violence. While Confucians and Mohists built their systems with bricks of logic, Zhuangzi watched them collapse in the face of real experience. To him, those moral and rational structures were like rulers trying to measure the wind. His rejection of rigid rationality wasn't anti-intellectual. Zhuangzi wasn't against thinking. He was against thinking that traps itself inside its own walls. He criticized the kind of reasoning that believes it can reduce the infinite world to words, categories, and systems, the kind of mind that becomes arrogant and forgets its own limits. His subtle critique of the mohists. Zhuangzi often mocked the mohists' obsession with logic and moral calculation. He saw them as engineers of virtue, trying to build a perfect world out of fixed pieces of right and wrong. What they called fairness, he saw as uniformity. What they called justice, he saw as lifeless order. Rather than attacking them through debate, Zhuangzi dismantled their logic with stories that collapse the logic of logic itself. He showed that trying to apply one moral rule to every situation is as absurd as teaching a fish to climb trees. Every being has its own way of living. Every moment demands its own response. This struck at the heart of mohist rationalism, the belief that there's a universal, calculable ought governing all things. For Zhuangzi, such thinking kills life. It freezes the natural flow of existence, the Tao, Taoist skepticism as an alternative. So what did Zhuangzi offer instead? Not the denial of the mind, but a liberating skepticism. He taught that reason has limits, and that beyond those limits lies another kind of wisdom, silent, intuitive, and lived rather than explained. This skepticism isn't nihilism. Zhuangzi didn't say life has no meaning. He said that meaning can't be captured in words. Language is a net, he wrote. Once you've caught the fish, forget the net. His critique wasn't aimed at reason itself, but at its idolization. He saw people of his time trying to fix moral crises with more doctrines, rules, and systems. But to him, the problem wasn't the lack of order, it was the excess of it. In a world of constant change, what we need isn't rigidity, but adaptability. He also ridiculed the school of names, philosophers obsessed with precision in logic and language. They debated questions like, is an egg already a chicken? Or, is a white horse really a horse? Zhuangzi thought such arguments were detached from life, men fighting in the dark, wounding themselves with their own weapons. Language is useful, he said, but it's not reality. True wisdom, he taught, doesn't cling or control, it knows when to let go. It's the wisdom of silence, of emptiness, of not knowing that recognizes its own limits, and therefore becomes wiser than any system. Knowledge that divides, wisdom that unites. The problem with rational knowledge, in Zhuangzi's view, is that it divides in order to understand. It separates subject from object, good from evil, truth from falsehood, useful from useless. Those divisions might serve practical needs, but they don't reflect the true nature of reality. Reality, the Tao, is continuous, not fragmented. It's constant transformation, not fixed categories. Trying to define it is like building islands in an endless ocean. The more we cling to those islands, the more we fear letting go, and the more we suffer. That's why Zhuangzi used metaphors. His story of dreaming he was a butterfly isn't about dreams. It's about the limit of reason. The rational mind wants a clear answer. Dream or reality? Subject or object? Zhuangzi laughs at the question. He doesn't seek an answer. He wants us to see that the question itself is misguided. For him, true wisdom isn't in having the right answer, but in realizing some questions don't need one. The scholar's trap. Zhuangzi had little admiration for conventional scholarship. Piling up books, theories, and citations doesn't make one wise. It often creates distance from life. The more a person fills the mind with other people's words, the less they hear the silence of existence. The scholar's mind is full, and so it cannot see. The sage's heart is empty, and so it perceives. He contrasts two ways of knowing: the knowledge of books and the knowledge of emptiness. The first tries to dominate reality. The second lets reality move through it. The first explains. The second simply harmonizes. Zhuangzi's critique wasn't anti-study. It was anti-attachment. Learning 1,000 books means nothing if you're still trapped in the illusion of a fixed self. Intuition as the path to the Tao. If rational knowledge fails, how do we approach the Tao? Through intuition. But for Zhuangzi, intuition isn't vague feeling or opinion. It's a deeper, wordless awareness that arises when the ego disappears. Like a master of martial arts who moves without thinking, the body acts in perfect unity with the moment. This kind of intuitive perception only happens when we stop interfering, stop analyzing, and simply are. At that point, the person and the Tao move as one, not because of any great theory, but because theory has been abandoned. He illustrates this with the story of Butcher Ting, who cuts oxen so skillfully his knife never dulls. He doesn't think. He follows the spaces between the joints. He moves with the Tao, effortlessly. That's intuitive wisdom. Acting without forcing, knowing without thinking, living without resistance. The Tao can't be explained, only lived for Zhuangzi. The Tao isn't something to worship or define. It's the invisible rhythm of existence itself. Trying to explain it is like trying to bottle the wind. The very act of explaining creates separation. That's why his writings are stories, metaphors, and paradoxes, not arguments. He didn't want to build logic. He wanted to dissolve it. If you use knowledge to seek the Tao, you will lose the Tao. The Tao cannot be reached, only followed. The real wisdom, then, doesn't control the mystery. It inhabits it. Rational thought demands proof and certainty. Intuitive wisdom asks only for silence, surrender, and presence. To reach that state, one must unlearn. Let go of what you think you know. Abandon the compulsion to label, judge, and define. The mind must become like a mirror. It reflects everything, but holds on to nothing. This emptiness isn't absence. It's openness. It's the space where the Tao flows through us. A mind full of certainty can't see what's in front of it. An empty mind sees effortlessly, acts naturally, understands without words. Wisdom as radical detachment. Zhuangzi didn't want to create scholars. He wanted to free consciousness. He didn't want us to think more, but to think less and lighter. When the noise of the mind fades, something greater can finally be heard. In the end, the wisdom he teaches is a radical form of letting go. Letting go of ego, opinions, systems, doctrines, even the very idea of wisdom. The true sage, in Zhuangzi's view, is one who doesn't need to be right, who can laugh at truths, who clings to nothing, and is therefore free. That freedom doesn't come from mastering the mind, but from trusting the flow of life. You don't need to understand the Tao to live in harmony with it. You just need to stop resisting. Zhuangzi dismantled reason. Not out of contempt for thought, but out of reverence for life itself. He knew that reality is far greater than any explanation, and that the kind of knowledge that truly liberates us isn't what fills the mind, but what empties it. Knowledge can make us intelligent, but only detachment can make us wise. To understand what Zhuangzi did with the concept of Wu Wei, often translated as non-action or effortless action, we need to go back to its original source in classical Taoism, particularly the Tao Te Ching attributed to Laozi. Laozi introduced Wu Wei as one of the central pillars of his worldview. In his philosophy, it doesn't mean literal inactivity or lazy passivity. Instead, it means acting in harmony with the natural flow of things, without resistance, without forcing events to follow our will. It's a kind of practical and spiritual wisdom, not interfering with the Tao, but adjusting to it, like water that bends around rocks without losing its direction. This idea was deeply countercultural at the time. In an age ruled by militarized kingdoms, the Confucian ideal of the virtuous man and the Mohist rationalization of morality, Laozi offered something completely different: withdrawal, silence, detachment, spontaneity. The wise person, for Laozi, doesn't govern by imposing rules, but by creating stillness where life can flourish on its own. The Tao never acts, yet nothing is left undone. That phrase captures the essence of Wu Wei. the non-action that paradoxically accomplishes everything. But with Zhuangzi, the idea goes even further. What in Laozi still referred to rulers and political balance becomes in Zhuangzi a radical existential experience, one aimed at inner freedom, total detachment, and the dissolution of the ego. In other words, Zhuangzi takes Wu Wei to its ultimate consequences. From the wise ruler to the useless man, Laozi still thought in terms of society, public order, and political harmony. His Wu Wei was also a critique of authoritarianism, almost a proto-anarchist philosophy. Yet he still addressed kings and leaders, urging them to act with humility and non-violence. Zhuangzi, on the other hand, wasn't interested in reforming politics or advising emperors. He wanted to free human consciousness from the chains it created for itself, moral, social, logical, and existential. For him, non-action wasn't a strategy for governing, but a way of being. In one symbolic story, he describes a man living on the margins of society, considered useless because he serves no practical function. Yet it's precisely his uselessness that makes him free. No one orders him around. No one exploits him. He simply exists, and that's enough. Here, Zhuangzi radicalizes Wu Wei. He turns non-action into a life ideal that rejects all external utility. True freedom, he says, is needing no one and nothing. He lived during the 4th century BCE, a time of political chaos known as the Warring States period. Every state fought for dominance, and philosophy became a tool of power. Thinkers competed in royal courts, offering advice on how to rule, discipline the people, win wars, and increase production. Confucians taught obedience and hierarchy. Mohists promoted a functional, utilitarian morality. Both believed that with the right knowledge and effort, the world could be improved and perfected. It was the age of deliberate action, moral and social engineering. Zhuangzi watched all this with a calm, ironic smile. To him, all these projects shared the same illusion, that humans can control the world. But the world doesn't follow our plans. It's in constant change, and the harder we try to force it, the further we drift from the Tao. In that sense, Wu Wei becomes silent resistance, not through force, but through refusal. Refusing power games, refusing the race for status, refusing to search for meaning outside of existence itself. Zhuangzi's revolution is internal, achieved not by weapons or arguments, but by emptying the will, a critique of the ideal of effort. In his time, virtue was tied to effort. The good man studied hard, disciplined himself, obeyed masters, and sacrificed for the greater good. Both Confucius and Mozi saw effort as the foundation of morality. Zhuangzi saw effort as a sign of disconnection from the Tao. What's aligned with the flow of life doesn't need to force anything. To illustrate this, he tells the story of Cook Ting, who carved oxen so effortlessly that his knife never dulled. He didn't think. He moved in perfect harmony with the natural gaps between the joints. That is Wu Wei in motion. Doing that doesn't oppose, acting that follows the natural course of things. True skill is effortless. Where there's effort, there's friction. Where there's friction, there's cutting. Where there's cutting, there's failure. At first glance simple, this metaphor reveals a deep lesson about action and nature. It's not about doing nothing. It's about doing without ego, acting without struggle, moving as if dancing, not pushing a boulder uphill. Non-action as total detachment. Zhuangzi's radical Wu Wei points to absolute detachment. It's not just about not acting against the flow, but about not acting for oneself. Actions arise naturally, free from desire, ambition, or self-image. That's only possible when the ego dissolves, and that's precisely what he proposes. The person of Wu Wei doesn't live for themselves or for others. They simply live. They don't project goals, demand outcomes, or compare. They act because life acts through them. This was revolutionary in a world obsessed with usefulness, glory, and moral virtue. In contrast, Zhuangzi said, "Be neither noble, nor wise, nor useful, just be." Wu Wei as subtle resistance. In an age of ideological tyranny, Wu Wei becomes a subtle form of resistance, not through confrontation, but through non-cooperation. The man of Wu Wei doesn't fight the world. He simply refuses to be captured by it. He lives on the margins, like the crooked tree no one wants, or the man unfit for the army or the court. That marginality is freedom, the space where the Tao can be lived without distraction or external values. Zhuangzi isn't trying to fix society. He's freeing humans from the need to belong to it. A wisdom that doesn't interfere. Zhuangzi's radical version of Wu Wei is a wisdom that doesn't impose, doesn't plan, doesn't interfere. Yet it's not a mission, it's a deeper action, one that rises from alignment with what's already happening. The sage doesn't make the world move, he moves with the world, and that's why he never wears out. Zhuangzi turned Laozi's political cosmic Wu Wei into a philosophy of personal liberation, a way of living quietly with the unspeakable. No ambitions, no glory, no strain, only presence. Wu Wei misunderstood. One of the most misunderstood Taoist ideas is Wu Wei. For minds shaped by Western thought, where action means control and purpose, non-action sounds like passivity or avoidance. But for Zhuangzi, Wu Wei is the opposite. It's the highest form of action, effortless, egoless, and free. It's acting the way nature acts, spontaneously, without hurry, yet with precision and balance. It's letting actions arise from the moment, not from rigid desires or fears. Zhuangzi turns this into a deep existential philosophy that redefines what it means to act and what it means to be free. Perfect virtue does not act, yet nothing is left undone. Zhuangzi. Doing versus forcing. For Zhuangzi, most human actions are poisoned by excess, too much will, too much control. The ego wants to impose its order on reality, to bend events to its plans. That tension breeds anxiety, frustration, and failure. Wu Wei isn't the absence of doing, it's the absence of artificial effort. It's moving naturally, like bamboo, bending with the wind, but never breaking. The sage still acts, but lightly. He acts when needed, without projecting a self into the act. His movement is so aligned with the moment that it seems to come not from him, but from the Tao itself. That requires sensitivity, the ability to hear the silent rhythm of the world and move with it. It's trusting that there's an intelligence in things, a wisdom of flow that can only be followed, not controlled. The butcher's lesson. Skill without effort. One of Zhuangzi's most beautiful parables is that of Butcher Ting. Known for his flawless skill, his knife stayed sharp after years of use. When asked his secret, he said he doesn't rely on sight or technique, but on intuition. He feels the spaces between the bones and moves where there's no resistance. I perceive with my spirit, not my eyes. My senses are still. My mind is free. That is Wu Wei at its finest, precise, effective, effortless. The butcher isn't passive, but he doesn't interfere either. His action is so in tune with the natural flow that it becomes an expression of the Tao itself. Zhuangzi invites us to act the same way, in work, speech, relationships, and daily life, without fighting what is, without the tension between what we are and what we want to appear to be. It's not withdrawal, it's non-egocentric action. The ego, source of unnecessary effort. For Zhuangzi, the key to Wu Wei is letting go of the ego. The ego is the source of forced effort. It wants to prove, control, and protect its image. The more it interferes, the heavier life becomes. Zhuangzi proposes a way of living where the I is no longer the center. Not the destruction of individuality, but its decentralization. Actions no longer come from fear or ambition, but from the living movement of the Tao. This demands trust. Trust that the world doesn't need to be pushed all the time, that there's a spontaneous, organic order already unfolding. When we align with it, action flows on its own. Wu Wei in everyday life. Unlike other schools that listed endless virtues, Zhuangzi offers something subtler, an invitation to listen to the moment. Acting without ego often means acting with less. fewer words, less intention, less haste. In everyday life, Wu Wei might look like this: speaking only what's needed, working with focus but without anxiety, letting an argument go even when you're right, waiting for the right timing before deciding, yielding without resentment when resistance would only cause pain. That's not submission, it's intelligence. It's what Zhuangzi calls moving with transformations instead of fighting them, dancing with reality rather than wrestling it. Wu Wei and impermanence. At the heart of Wu Wei lies an understanding of impermanence. Everything changes. Trying to fix or freeze life brings suffering. Zhuangzi saw that human pain often comes from forcing what isn't ready or clinging to what can't last. Wu Wei means living with open hands, accepting that not everything can or should be controlled. That acceptance isn't weakness, it's strength. The strength of flexibility, sensitivity, and presence. Freedom. Acting without being dragged in Wu Wei, Zhuangzi finds inner freedom. The one who lives this way isn't ruled by social pressure or ego demands. They're free because they no longer depend on external approval or validation. Whether in the city or in solitude, their actions come from harmony, not control. It's a rare kind of freedom. The quiet courage to not resist, not impose, not demand more than necessary. Doing only what needs to be done. One of Wu Wei's greatest lessons is simple. Don't do what doesn't need to be done. How often do we act just to react? Speak just to be heard? Interfere out of pride? Zhuangzi invites us to pause and ask, does this really need to be done? Does it come from harmony with the Tao or from my need to control? When we ask honestly, most actions fall away, and what remains is the essential. Zhuangzi shows that Wu Wei isn't passivity, but presence, not apathy, but lightness, not the absence of action, but action that doesn't fight reality. It's a silent, humble, detached philosophy, and at the same time, one of the boldest ever conceived. Because it challenges everything we've been taught about effort, achievement, and control. Wu Wei is acting with the world, not against it. It's letting go of the need to be the author of life, and finally becoming part of the dance. If the philosophers of his time wrote like lawmakers, full of rules, definitions, and formulas, Zhuangzi wrote like someone dreaming. Where others offered solid doctrines and closed arguments, he gave us fables, metaphors, paradoxes, and gentle laughter that quietly dismantled certainty. His book, the Zhuangzi, stands as a literary body with no equal in ancient Chinese thought. It doesn't follow logical structures, cling to systematic coherence, or aim to order the world. Quite the opposite. It seeks to free the mind from the desire to control. Historically, this stylistic choice was more than aesthetic. It was a philosophical stance, a form of resistance to the rationalism dominating the main schools of the Warring States period. In an age of intense intellectual activity, how you spoke was as important as what you said. With poetic intuition, Zhuangzi realized that to speak of the Tao, that which cannot be named or defined, language must stop asserting and start suggesting. He lived during one of the most creative and tense eras in Chinese intellectual history, known as the 100 Schools of Thought. Different philosophical currents competed for influence over rulers and society's future. The Confucians wrote moral treatises and defended an ethic based on rituals, duties, and well-defined virtues. The Mohists built utilitarian arguments and rigid moral systems focused on practical reasoning. Even the legalists, obsessed with laws and punishments, organized their ideas into administrative handbooks. Each school trusted in the power of structured language, the ideal of clear, logical, grounded discourse, much like the modern academic style. The philosopher's role was to create coherent systems, sharp distinctions, and concepts with moral or political utility. But Zhuangzi refused to play that game. He saw that trying to describe the world precisely is what distances us from it. Any language that tries to capture reality, especially the Tao, inevitably limits, distorts, and freezes what is, by nature, fluid, changing, and formless. So he chose another way, indirect speech, a narrative style that breaks linearity, rigidity, and the obsession with logic. In doing so, Zhuangzi didn't just innovate literarily, he founded a new way of doing philosophy, fables as tools for liberation. Unlike treatises that try to prove something, Zhuangzi's fables try to awaken something. They don't lead the reader to a conclusion, but to a state of mind. Instead of teaching truths, they plant doubts. And it's within that space of doubt that the Tao can emerge, not as knowledge, but as an experience of openness. One of his most famous stories tells of the giant fish-kun who transforms into a vast bird called Peng. The bird flies for 6 months straight, reaching heights no ordinary being can comprehend. Smaller birds mock it, saying it's exaggerated. But Zhuangzi isn't interested in what's real. He wants to challenge our scale of judgment. What's big? What's small? From what perspective do we measure reality? The fable offers no answer, only discomfort. And within that discomfort lies wisdom. Zhuangzi uses stories to shake up habitual thinking, the kind that always wants to classify and label. His fables don't preach a doctrine, they break the frame through which we view life. Imaginary dialogues, breaking dogmatic knowledge. Zhuangzi masterfully used imaginary dialogues, conversations between historical, mythical, or fictional figures. Sometimes he even speaks with Confucius, with talking skeletons, with spirits, or with the wind itself. These dialogues aren't meant to assert stable truths. They work like broken mirrors, each reflection undoing the last. They stage the collapse of rigid reason. Zhuangzi dramatizes situations where logical argument falls apart before a wider, livelier, more paradoxical view of existence. In his famous dialogue on the happiness of fish, he and his friend Hui Shi argue about whether it's possible to know if fish are happy. The conversation spirals, each response contradicting the last, until no one wins. And that's the point. The dialogue isn't meant to convince, but to expose the limits of language itself. Another hallmark of the Zhuangzi is its subtle humor. In a culture where the wise were often portrayed as solemn and severe, Zhuangzi appears light, ironic, almost playful. His humor, however, isn't shallow. It comes from detachment, from seeing that the world is full of contradictions and absurdities, and that trying to control it only deepens suffering. He laughs at scholars, moralists, and logical thinkers. But his laughter isn't mocking. It's liberating. It's the laughter of someone who no longer needs to be right, who's seen that the search for conceptual security is endless. It's the laughter of someone who lives in the fertile emptiness of the Tao. The form is the philosophy. The Zhuangzi's style isn't just a literary technique. It's part of its philosophy. Form and content are inseparable. To speak logically about the Tao would be a mistake, because the Tao can't be captured by logic or definition. It must be hinted at, lived, and experienced. His parables are like fingers pointing to the moon. They're not the moon itself, but they help us see it. His use of absurdity, imagination, and poetry mirrors the Tao's own multiplicity and flow. Instead of representing reality, he disorients perception, forcing the reader to release control and open to change, impermanence, and mystery. Reading Zhuangzi feels like transformation itself. The text resists capture. Every rereading reveals new layers. Every metaphor can mean something else. Like the Tao, it refuses to be fixed. This literary freedom influenced not only Taoist thought, but also poetry, Zen Buddhism, and art across Asia. Monks, poets, and even Western writers were inspired by Zhuangzi's lightness and irony. His writing isn't a doctrine. It's an echo chamber where the reader must lose themselves to be found again. Choosing stories over systems wasn't an escape from philosophy. It was a new form of it. A way that doesn't build systems, but tears down walls. That doesn't teach truth, but unmasks illusion. That doesn't try to organize the world, but dances with it. Zhuangzi wrote with words, but didn't want readers to cling to them. He used stories, but didn't expect us to believe them. He created characters and metaphors, not to teach fixed truths, but to make those truths collapse before our eyes. Each story, each paradox, each absurd image is a gentle strike against certainty. They unseat the mind, suspend the habit of seeking definitive answers, and in that silence, the Tao, unspeakable and undefined, can finally appear. Zhuangzi wasn't a teacher of truth. He was a breaker of illusions. And his stories were the tools of that liberation, not through aggression, but through subtlety, humor, poetry, and quiet. Language as a trap and a key. At the core of Zhuangzi's philosophy lies a sharp understanding of language's limits. Language, he says, is never neutral. The moment we name something, we separate it from the living flow of reality. Words frame, divide, and freeze what is whole. By saying, this is good, or this is bad, we step away from the Tao, which knows no such divisions. Words are like nets. You use the net to catch the fish, but once you have the fish, you forget the net. So it is with words. They are tools for pointing, not for holding. Knowing that, Zhuangzi turns away from logical treatises towards symbolic narrative. Instead of declaring truth, he tells stories that make truths wobble. He realized the only way to speak of the unspeakable is indirectly, through the poetic and non-linear. That's why his book is full of talking animals, flying sages, laughing skeletons, and dreams that blur the line between real and illusion. It's as if he's saying, if you want to understand the Tao, stop trying to understand. Let the story pass through you. And maybe you'll know, without knowing that you know. Stories that break the habit of judgment. One of Zhuangzi's main targets was fixed judgment, ideas of right and wrong, useful and useless, beautiful and ugly. He saw how these judgments come from personal perspective and cultural habit, not universal truth. To dismantle this thinking, he told stories that make us laugh, and then think, like the story of the deformed man whose body made him unfit for work or war. Everyone saw him as useless, but that very uselessness saved his life. Zhuangzi isn't saying we should all be deformed. He's showing that what looks worthless might actually be freedom. By flipping our expectations, he exposes how unstable our values really are. His stories train us to hesitate before judging, to leave a space between what happens and what we conclude. That space, that pause, is where the Tao begins. Doubt as a form of wisdom. While other schools sought solid foundations, Zhuangzi cultivated doubt. Not the anxious kind that searches for a new certainty, but the peaceful kind that opens room for freedom. In his most famous parable, The Butterfly Dream, he writes, he once dreamed he was a butterfly, flying joyfully from flower to flower. When he woke, he was Zhuangzi again. But then he wondered, am I Zhuangzi who dreamed I was a butterfly, or a butterfly now dreaming I'm Zhuangzi? There's no answer, and that's the point. The story shakes the center of the self, questioning identity, consciousness, and reality itself. The reader leaves not with more clarity, but with more wonder. And that's exactly the goal. For Zhuangzi, doubt isn't weakness, it's an opening. The Tao can't be known, only lived. And to live it, we must let go of our need to know. His stories create that space. They unbalance the mind, knock us off the bicycle of logic, so we can feel the ground beneath us for a moment. This isn't irrationality. It's a deeper form of knowing, one that speaks through presence, intuition, and silence. It can't be taught through doctrines, only hinted at through images, gestures, and atmosphere. That's what his stories create. An atmosphere where the linear mind dissolves, and something quieter, like a glimpse, can emerge. Zhuangzi doesn't want you to understand the Tao. He wants you to stop trying. And maybe, in that stillness, something will appear. His stories are like reflections on water. Try to grab them, and they vanish. Look softly, and they reveal what no theory ever could. Why stories, not systems? Zhuangzi could have written like Confucius, with aphorisms and lessons, or like Mozi, with moral logic and structure. But he chose stories, and that says everything, because the Tao is not a system. It can't be systematized or turned into a method. The Tao is process, transformation, fertile emptiness, and the only way to speak of it is through a language that respects its nature, the language of stories. Stories don't claim. They suggest. They don't bind. They point. They don't dominate. They flow. Among all the images Chinese philosophy has given to the history of human thought, few are as poetic and mysterious as the one found in Chapter 2 of Zhuangzi. Once, Zhuangzi dreamed he was a butterfly. He fluttered about, light and free, not knowing he was Zhou. Then he woke up, and there he was, Zhuangzi again. But he didn't know if he was Zhuangzi who had dreamed he was a butterfly, or a butterfly now dreaming he was Zhuangzi. With this brief and unadorned passage, Zhuangzi created one of the most enduring symbols in world philosophy. The butterfly dream became a cornerstone of Taoist thought, elegantly and disarmingly expressing its core themes. The fluidity of identity, the blurred line between reality and illusion, the constant transformation of all things, and the rejection of rigid, fixed definitions of what is. To understand why this small parable became so powerful, we need to look at the historical and philosophical context in which it was written. The invisible line between dream and wakefulness. Zhuangzi's question isn't absurd. It's uncomfortably close to home. When we dream, everything feels real. We only realize it was an illusion after we wake up. But what if we never truly wake up? What if what we call being awake is just another, longer, more coherent dream? Zhuangzi isn't playing with words. He's pointing to something deeper. He's suggesting that what we call reality, solid, objective, distinct from dreams, might be a mental, cultural, or linguistic construction. And if that's true, then the line between dreaming and waking begins to blur. The border between reality and illusion becomes unclear. This is a kind of ontological skepticism. Not skepticism as in nothing is real, but skepticism as in refusing the illusion of certainty. It's not just doubt about knowledge, but about the very structure of what is real. Zhuangzi asks, how do you know this is real? But even more, what does it mean to call something real? And deeper still, who are you, the one who believes you're real? The fluidity of the self, or the disappearance of the center. The power and beauty of this parable lie in the fact that it doesn't just question the world out there, it questions the self. If I can dream that I'm someone else, and in that dream fully feel like that other being, then the I think I am isn't as solid as I imagine. The butterfly in the dream doesn't know it's Zhuangzi. It lives, feels, and moves as a butterfly. And when Zhuangzi wakes up, he realizes his identity was completely gone in that state, and yet somehow it was still him. This reveals one of Zhuangzi's most profound insights. The self is fluid. It isn't a thing. It's a process, a constant transformation. In just a few lines, he dissolves centuries of thinking that treated the self as something fixed and permanent. And that idea is deeply liberating, because if the self isn't fixed, it isn't trapped by roles, identities, or expectations. It can change, flow, transform. It can become. Zhuangzi calls this the freedom to transform with things. Perhaps the deepest kind of freedom imaginable, the freedom not to be only one thing, skepticism as openness, not negation. Zhuangzi isn't saying that nothing exists or that reality doesn't matter. He's doing something subtler and far more profound. He's softening our grip on certainty. His doubt isn't the kind that paralyzes, it's the kind that frees. It takes us out of the role of masters of reality and places us back in the flow of life. Instead of trying to control what is, we learn to move with it. This isn't passivity, it's awareness. It's wisdom that doesn't impose answers, but lives comfortably among questions. And that's rare and revolutionary. The dissolution of reality, an illusion. Western philosophy, from Plato onward, built its foundations on a grand opposition: the real versus the illusory, the true world versus the apparent one. Zhuangzi breaks that duality. For him, real and unreal are not absolute categories. They're modes of experience. The butterfly dream doesn't say everything is illusion, but rather that there's no ultimate criterion separating real from unreal. Every perception is filtered, every language symbolic, every experience relative. Trying to fix reality is like trying to hold the wind. The moment you grab it, it's gone. So Zhuangzi invites us to live without this obsession to divide, categorize, or judge. And ironically, that may bring us closer to what's truly real, precisely because we stop trying to freeze it. Dreaming as a form of wisdom. Curiously, in Zhuangzi's vision, the dream, usually seen as a symbol of illusion, becomes a symbol of wisdom. Because in dreams, we're free from the rigid boundaries of the self, from social rules, from the limits of language. The butterfly he dreams of doesn't think about identity or truth. It simply flies, in tune with the wind, the flowers, the moment. And maybe that's the highest form of wisdom, to live lightly, without the need to control. In that sense, the dream mirrors the Tao itself. The Tao can't be defined or owned. It can only be lived, indirectly, effortlessly. Like the dream, the Tao is movement, change, freedom of form. Mystery as a philosophical experience. At the end of the parable, Zhuangzi doesn't give an answer. He doesn't tell us if he was the man dreaming or the butterfly. He leaves the question open, alive. That's what makes Taoist philosophy so unique. It doesn't want to give you ground. It wants to teach you how to dance in mid-air. Zhuangzi's skepticism isn't denial. It's trust in mystery. It's the acceptance that not everything needs to be explained to be lived deeply. A mirror for those who dare to look. The butterfly dream is, at its core, a mirror. Everyone sees something different in it. For some, it's a riddle about logic. For others, a challenge to philosophy itself. But for those who allow themselves to sink into it, it becomes an invitation to let go of the illusion of control and to realize that maybe the greatest freedom lies in not knowing. What if we really are butterflies? What if reality is lighter and more subtle than we think? What if the self is just the name we give to a passing moment? Zhuangzi doesn't answer. He just smiles, closes his eyes, and keeps dreaming. Against fixation, the philosophy of impermanence. By asking whether it was Zhuangzi dreaming he was a butterfly or a butterfly dreaming it was Zhuangzi, the story dissolves every major philosophical boundary between dream and reality, self and other, identity and transformation. At a time when thinkers were building systems of certainty, defining what's true and false, right and wrong, Zhuangzi suspended all category. This wasn't just a literary gesture. It was a revolutionary philosophical act. Where Confucians preached the construction of a stable moral self, Zhuangzi deconstructed the very idea of self. If you can dream you're someone else and wake unsure of who you are, who, exactly, is you? Where does the boundary lie between self and other, between dreaming and being? This breakdown of identity, written in the 4th century BCE, shattered the rationalist models of the time, which saw the subject as stable, self-aware, and morally consistent. Zhuangzi instead shows the self as porous, mutable, transient, a momentary expression of the Tao's continuous flow, the Tao and the dissolution of dualities. Both Laozi and Zhuangzi share a goal, to transcend fixed dualities. Good and evil, big and small, life and death, waking and dreaming. These are only relative perspectives. The Tao, as the ultimate reality, lies beyond them. It is the undivided flow that produces and dissolves all opposite. In ancient China's intellectual climate, filled with schools like Mohism, which sought objective moral systems, and the school of names, obsessed with logical precision, Zhuangzi's parable was almost provocative. He laughed at the obsession with definition. Instead of fixing meanings, he floated among them. The butterfly, light, short-lived, drifting without direction, is more than poetic imagery. It's a mirror of the Tao, formless, ever-changing, unbound by identity. And the tension between dream and waking, for Zhuangzi, is not a problem to solve. It's the natural condition of existence. Cultural legacy and influence. The butterfly dream's influence has spanned centuries. It became a symbol of Taoist thought, referenced by poets, monks, painters, and philosophers across China, and later around the world. In Chan, Zen Buddhism, the story perfectly aligns with the idea that all things are illusion, Maya, and that the self is an empty construct. Chinese monks read Zhuangzi not as dogma, but as living wisdom. His literary style and existential depth shaped Zen meditation, poetry, and art. In Chinese literature, the butterfly gained a life of its own, symbolizing ephemerality, dreams, and transformation. Artists painted Zhuangzi sleeping beneath a tree, a butterfly floating above him. Poets used the image to speak of love, time, death, and the fragility of identity. Even in the West, thinkers like Gilles Deleuze, Jean-François Lyotard, and Jorge Luis Borges saw in Zhuangzi's butterfly a philosophical gesture that anticipated post-structuralism, deconstruction, and perspectivism. Borges once said, "Zhuangzi dreamed the philosophy of the entire world before it ever existed." A question that never grows old. The beauty of this passage lies in its resistance to final interpretation. Every time you try to define it, it slips away, like a dream fading at dawn. That's exactly what makes it eternal. The butterfly dream isn't a riddle to solve. It's a question to live with. A mirror showing how desperately we still cling to dividing real from unreal, self from other, reason from intuition. And Zhuangzi, smiling softly, seems to whisper, "Who said you need to know? Maybe it's enough to dance with uncertainty." Zhuangzi lived in a collapsing world, politically, ethically, intellectually, and instead of rebuilding it with systems, he left us an image, a butterfly, a dream, a question. And maybe in that gesture, he did more than any system ever could. He taught us how to let go of certainty and make room for mystery. During the turbulent Warring States period, 4th century BCE, China was experiencing the collapse of its traditional order. The Zhou dynasty, which for centuries had maintained a ritualistic and hierarchical structure based on harmony between heaven, earth, and humanity, had lost control over the regional states. What followed was a time of constant warfare, famine, mass migrations, and deep moral and political uncertainty. In this climate of instability, several philosophical schools emerged, each trying to restore order. The most influential was Confucianism, led by Confucius, Zhuangzi, and his disciples, who sought to build an ethical foundation capable of stabilizing society through virtues such as Ren, benevolence, Li, ritual propriety, Yi, righteousness, and Ji, moral wisdom. The Confucian worldview rested on a key principle: morality is objective, universal, and can be cultivated through education, role models, and adherence to ancestral rituals. These virtues were seen as the pillars of society. Without them, chaos would reign. The Yunzi, noble person, was the moral ideal, someone who shaped their conduct according to these virtues, fulfilling their social role and the expectations of the collective. Therefore, Confucians defended hierarchy as part of the natural order. Everyone had a role to play: ruler as ruler, son as son, servant as servant. Morality was seen as fixed, inherited from tradition, and to be applied uniformly and unquestioningly. It was against this way of thinking that Zhuangzi rebelled. Zhuangzi and the subversion of virtue. While the Confucians spoke with the solemn tone of those who believed they were building civilization, Zhuangzi spoke with the freedom of someone who knew that all civilizations eventually fade. Where Confucianism saw morality as an anchor, Zhuangzi saw a prison. For him, the attempt to define morality through absolute rules was not just futile, it was harmful. Born from the human desire for control and predictability, rigid morality ignored the multiplicity and fluidity of life. Zhuangzi believed that trying to standardize human behavior through fixed virtues led, paradoxically, to artificial conduct, disconnected from the natural flow of the Tao. While Confucians wanted to educate people to conform to a universal model of virtue, Zhuangzi wanted to free people from any moral constraint that suffocated their spontaneity. His ideal was not the Zhuangzi, but the Zhen Ren, the true person who lives in harmony with the Tao, not with external standards. The political and moral context. Zhuangzi's critique of rigid morality becomes clearer when viewed in the political and ethical context of his time. By the 4th century BCE, Confucian thought had already become dominant among scholars and bureaucrats. Its principles weren't just ethical, they were also tools of social control. Through Confucian morality, rulers hoped to shape citizens who were obedient, stable, and productive. Virtue became a public performance rather than an inner quality. Many followed it not out of wisdom, but out of fear or desire for approval. Zhuangzi saw the artificiality of this behavior and questioned whether what people called virtue was truly virtue, or just conformity disguised as goodness. In his parables, he often mocked moralists, showing how their doctrines, rather than bringing people closer to a full life, actually distanced them from freedom, authenticity, and the Tao. Stories and examples in the Zhuangzi. In many stories, Zhuangzi ridicules the Confucians' claim to universal moral laws. One famous example is the man who lost his axe. A man suspects that his neighbor has stolen his axe. From that moment, everything the neighbor does looks like something a thief would do. Then, one day, the man finds his axe in the forest, and suddenly the neighbor no longer looks like a thief at all. This parable reveals how moral judgment is subjective, emotional, and conditioned, not absolute or objective as Confucians claimed. For Zhuangzi, morality is always contextual. Trying to apply a fixed rule to an ever-changing reality is like trying to draw the wind with charcoal. Another story tells of a man born crippled who, though useless by society's standards, lives peacefully and freely. He isn't called to war or made to work hard. Because he doesn't fit social or moral standards, he lives in harmony with the Tao. His apparent uselessness becomes his wisdom. Such stories show how virtue, when turned into a rigid standard, becomes a trap, and how the obsession with virtue often hides the human desire for control, whether over others or oneself. Zhuangzi's withdrawal from politics. Unlike many thinkers of his time, Zhuangzi refused invitations to serve in government. In one famous story, a high-ranking official offers him a prestigious post. Zhuangzi replies with a metaphor. Would he rather be a dead turtle, worshipped in the royal temple, or a living turtle, happily dragging its tail through the mud? He chooses the mud. This refusal was more than personal freedom. It was a philosophical statement. Zhuangzi understood that within the machinery of the state, even morality becomes a tool of power. By refusing to participate, he preserved not only his independence, but the integrity of wisdom itself. While moralists tried to shape the human soul to fit society, Zhuangzi did the opposite. He wanted to free the soul from society so it could rediscover its natural spontaneity. Is morality a necessary illusion? Zhuangzi wasn't a nihilist. He didn't deny morality altogether. What he rejected was rigid, absolute morality. Morality imposed as a universal truth. For him, moral codes should be alive, flexible, and responsive to context. His vision was an ethics without moralism, a wisdom that doesn't come from obeying rules, but from listening deeply to the flow of life. True virtue, he said, isn't learned. It's lived. And it can only emerge from someone who isn't trying to be good, but is simply in harmony with the Tao. Zhuangzi's critique of Confucian moralism was ultimately a defense of life's diversity. He opposed any system that tried to confine the human spirit or turn wisdom into commandments. In a world full of wars, codes, and laws, he offered something rare: a light, ironic, open path, where ethics isn't memorized or forced, but flows like the wind, invisible, yet always present. To Zhuangzi, the problem wasn't morality itself, but the attempt to make it mandatory, uniform, and standardized, incompatible with the living, changing nature of humanity. True morality, he believed, must arise from within, from the natural movement of the Tao, not from obedience to external laws or social expectations. The Tao and the origin of moral action. At the heart of Zhuangzi's philosophy is the Tao, the way. But the Tao isn't a pre-made road or a divine law. It's the natural order of the universe, spontaneous, silent, unpredictable. Because of that, Zhuangzi believed that truly ethical action doesn't come from calculation or rules, but from alignment with the Tao. Just as water finds its own path, humans act rightly when they flow with their nature instead of resisting it. Life, he said, carries its own wisdom. The wise person doesn't oppose reality, they move with it. This is the essence of Wu Wei. Non-forced action, acting without strain, without ego, without resistance to what is. Imposed morality as violence against nature. Zhuangzi distrusted attempts to mold people through universal moral systems, as the Confucians did. To him, that was like turning nature into a machine. By dividing the world into right and wrong, virtue and vice, good and evil, moralists freeze what should remain fluid. This rigidity, he argued, is a form of violence against the spontaneity of life. Instead of allowing each being to find its own rhythm, moral doctrines try to normalize and categorize everything, and the result is hypocrisy. People begin to pretend virtue, follow empty rituals, and hide their true feelings behind moral masks. In one of his most provocative passages, Zhuangzi says that virtuous men are often more concerned with appearances than with truth. Virtue, in that case, stops being a living expression and becomes a performance. The ethics of not knowing Zhuangzi also proposed an ethics based not on absolute knowledge, but on sensitive awareness, the ability to listen to the moment. He didn't believe in universal formulas for right action. Every situation is unique, and every response should arise from inner stillness, not repetition. The moralist looks for what's right in general. Zhuangzi looks for what's true right now. That's why, in his philosophy, the wise person doesn't cling to rules. They stay attuned to the subtle signs of the world. They act like water, adapting, responding, moving without resistance. This kind of wisdom is more like art than science. It requires sensitivity, detachment, and presence. Above all, it requires the ego to step aside, because the greatest obstacle to spontaneous action is the desire to control. Naturalness as the foundation of ethics. Zhuangzi taught that true virtue grows like a plant, naturally, if given space. It doesn't need to be forced. Human beings, in their most natural state, already carry the capacity for compassion, balance, and care. What suppresses it are external demands, social pressure, moral expectations, and the obsession with doing the right thing. He didn't argue for abandoning ethics altogether. He argued that ethics should grow from within, not be imposed from without. It should come from harmony with nature, the environment, and the present moment, not from abstract ideals of how things should be. To Zhuangzi, the best way to be just isn't to master theories of justice, but to live simply and attentively. Someone in tune with the Tao doesn't need codes to know what to do. Their action flows naturally, without effort or display. The wisdom of the useless. One of Zhuangzi's most subtle critiques of rigid morality is his celebration of the useless. He tells stories of crooked trees, imperfect bodies, and people unfit for war or labor. Yet these useless beings live peacefully and freely. In this context, uselessness means non-conformity, not fitting into imposed standards. And that's precisely where true life shows itself. Living well, for Zhuangzi, doesn't mean meeting expectations. It means being true to one's nature. Rigid morality values what is useful, productive, and virtuous by the book. Zhuangzi values what overflows, what can't be confined. In doing so, he reminds us that real ethics may lie outside society's gaze. In the end, Zhuangzi's critique of morality isn't a call to chaos. It's an invitation to lightness. He believed that when we stop trying to control life, to fit existence into rules, to fake virtue for approval, when we stop all that, life finds its own balance. That balance doesn't need rules. It needs space. It needs silence. It needs trust in the wisdom of simply being alive. And maybe that's Zhuangzi's greatest ethical lesson. Don't try to be good. Just stop getting in the way of the goodness that's already here. Thinkers who stood out during the Warring States period, Confucians, legalists, and mohists, often aspired to serve the state. Their doctrines weren't just ethical reflections. They were blueprints for social and political reform. Many philosophers saw themselves as reformers, offering ways to restore order through reason, law, or morality. Zhuangzi, however, refused that role. It's said that the king of Chu, impressed by Zhuangzi's wisdom, offered him a prestigious position as a royal advisor. The post came with status, wealth, and influence, everything most people would dream of. But Zhuangzi replied with an image that became legendary. I've heard that in your ancestral temple, there's a sacred turtle that died 3,000 years ago. It's kept in a box, covered with cloth, and revered with rituals. Tell me, Your Majesty, would that turtle rather be dead and honored, or alive, dragging its tail through the mud? The king answered, alive in the mud. Zhuangzi smiled and said, so would I. That answer wasn't just clever, it was a declaration of freedom, a refusal to accept everything his culture celebrated: prestige, authority, and power. For Zhuangzi, taking the position would have meant selling his soul for a title, trading freedom for glory, integrity for vanity, glory as a beautiful cage. In ancient China, serving the government was considered the peak of moral and intellectual achievement. The Confucian ideal of the Zhuangzi, the noble man, included a duty to serve the world, take public responsibility, and guide the people. Being invited to court was the highest honor. Refusing it was almost unthinkable. But to Zhuangzi, that honor was a trap. He saw the state as a system that corrupted human nature with promises of power and prestige. The moment a man entered that game, he began to live by ambition and fear of failure, fear of losing reputation. And when the ego takes control, Zhuangzi said, freedom disappears. He realized that scholars, in their attempts to govern wisely, were enslaving themselves to their own systems. They became dependent on approval, reputation, and public image. Their actions ceased to be natural. They became performances, living outside the golden cage. By rejecting the royal court, Zhuangzi wasn't just making a personal choice. He was breaking away from an entire worldview. His society believed a person's worth came from public usefulness. Zhuangzi disagreed. For him, value came from living in harmony with one's own nature. That didn't mean isolation or hatred of others. Zhuangzi wasn't a recluse, but he knew that in a world obsessed with power, titles, and appearances, the only way to remain free was to not play the game. The wise man, in his view, isn't seduced by rewards. He lives simply, away from ambition, without trying to convince anyone of anything. He watches the world as one watches a river, knowing that everything flows, and clinging to things like fame or status only means swimming against the current of life. The ego as the source of illusion. For Zhuangzi, the ego was the root of all restlessness. It's the ego that craves recognition, fears failure, and demands admiration. Even noble positions feed this illusion of importance, and the more you feed it, the further you drift from the Tao. He saw society as a theatre of masks, everyone acting out roles to appear virtuous or successful. His laughter, sharp, ironic, but never cruel, stripped away those masks one by one. To him, serving the state meant feeding an artificial self, one that depends on validation. True wisdom, on the other hand, meant dissolving that self, not inflating it. To be free is to not need to be someone. At the heart of Zhuangzi's philosophy lies a bold question. Do we really need to be someone to live well? The culture of the court said yes, that a noble man must prove his worth. Zhuangzi answered with silence, with the calm of someone walking through fields, eating wild fruit, and letting the world turn without trying to control it. Real freedom for him meant not depending on any fixed identity, not needing to defend an image, a title, or a legacy. The man free of ego can laugh at himself, change his mind, lose or win without attachment. So when Zhuangzi turned down the king's offer, it wasn't just independence, it was philosophy in action. He chose the path of no fame, no power, no audience, but full integrity. Silent resistance. In a time when morality was public, success was visible, and virtue was measured by social service, Zhuangzi practiced a different kind of resistance, an inner one. He didn't write political manifestos or form schools. He told stories. He laughed. That lightness wasn't escape. It was strength. He understood that the only way to remain free in a world of chains is to not cling even to the desire for freedom. He didn't want to free the world. He simply wanted to live without needing to. For Zhuangzi, freedom wasn't something to win or earn. It wasn't about owning things or having unlimited choice. It was a state of being, quiet, detached, unburdened by the I. True freedom, he said, doesn't come from control. It comes from letting go of control, the ego as an invisible prison. Zhuangzi saw the ego, this rigid sense of me, of control, of separation, as the main source of human anxiety. The ego always wants recognition, validation, safety. It compares, envies, fears. It demands that life bend to its will. But life doesn't. The world changes. Bodies age. Relationships end. Trying to hold on to a fixed self in a moving universe is like trying to hold water in your hands. The tighter you grip, the faster it slips away. Zhuangzi's answer was simple. Stop holding on. Don't fight the ego. Just stop feeding it. Stop believing it's the center of everything. And when it fades, what's left isn't emptiness. It's freedom. Letting go of desire, not as morality, but as ease. Zhuangzi didn't condemn desire with moral judgment. He didn't call it sinful or wrong. He simply saw it for what it is. Endless. Desire, he said, is like a hook in the soul. It pulls us outward, away from peace. We chase one thing after another. Power, love, security. And every victory brings a new fear of loss. The wise person doesn't live chasing what they want. They flow with what comes. They welcome life instead of demanding from it. This isn't apathy, it's clarity. Letting go of desire isn't rejecting life, it's making peace with it. It's the end of that constant voice saying, I need this to be happy. When the ego dissolves, so does that voice, and in its place comes rest, the calm of simply being, flowing with the Tao, freedom without control. The Tao, for Zhuangzi, isn't a god or moral force. It's the natural rhythm of existence, silent, spontaneous, unpredictable. To flow with the Tao is to stop resisting life, to stop needing to win, plan, or control. The ordinary man wants to impose his will on the world. The man of the Tao doesn't impose at all. He moves like water, filling what is open, flowing around what is blocked, adapting without losing himself. That's why he's free. Freedom, for Zhuangzi, has nothing to do with circumstance. A man can be in prison and still be free, if his spirit isn't enslaved by desire. He can live among crowds and still keep his inner silence. To flow with the Tao is to stop fighting the river and realize you've always been part of it. The true person and the transcendence of self. Zhuangzi's Zhen Ren, the true person, transcends individuality. But that doesn't mean losing one's humanity or becoming mystical. It means seeing that the self we defend, our roles, memories, fears, and ambitions, is only a small part of what we are. We are also nature, wind, movement, and silence. We belong to something larger, and our suffering comes from forgetting that. The true person doesn't cling to an image. He can change, make mistakes, and laugh at himself. He doesn't need to protect a fragile I. He lives peacefully with impermanence, and that's why he's free. A lesson in existential lightness. One of Zhuangzi's most powerful stories is about his wife's death. When his students found him singing instead of mourning, they were shocked. He explained that before she was born, she didn't exist. She was simply part of the Tao. Birth, life, and death are just stages in an endless transformation. Why mourn what's part of the whole? That's not indifference. It's understanding. Zhuangzi didn't deny grief. He just didn't resist it. He accepted life as it is, celebrated its flow, and didn't cling to what must change. That's the freedom he offered, a lightness born from accepting impermanence, a joy that doesn't depend on circumstances, but on clarity. In a world that worships control, Zhuangzi offered something radical: letting go. Let go of ego, and life becomes light. Let go of desire, and the world stops being an enemy. Let go of who you think you are, and discover the self that doesn't need a name. The true person, said Zhuangzi, isn't the one who conquers the world. It's the one who no longer needs to. The one who lives with the world, not against it. Who no longer sees separation, and in that unity finds true freedom, the freedom of simply being. In 4th century BCE China, the time of Zhuangzi, the world was in deep transition. The old Zhou order, built on ritual, hierarchy, and inherited values, was collapsing. The states that once formed a symbolic confederation under the Zhou emperor were now fighting one another for dominance. This period, known as the Warring States era, was not only an age of war, but also of spiritual and intellectual upheaval. Amid this chaos, many schools of thought emerged, each trying to offer a way out of the civilizational crisis. Confucianism sought to restore moral order through traditional ethics. Legalism defended absolute state power and strict discipline as tools for stability. Mohism promoted a utilitarian vision based on universal love and practical efficiency. Zhuangzi, however, chose a different path. He didn't want to rebuild the old order or design a new one. Instead, he turned toward the ever-changing nature of reality, insisting that the world doesn't need to be fixed. It needs to be understood in its movement. And this idea has one central name: transformation. The cosmology of change. The notion of constant transformation, bianhua, lies at the heart of Taoist cosmology, and Zhuangzi was one of its greatest interpreters. Influenced by Laozi and the older Taoist spirit, he saw the universe not as a static structure, but as a continuous flow of change. Everything shifts, nothing stays the same. Birth turns into death, strength fades into weakness, success becomes failure. Heat cools, youth vanishes. The political glory of today's kingdom becomes tomorrow's dust. For Zhuangzi, impermanence isn't a tragedy. It's the way reality works. Understanding this is the first step toward peace with life itself. This idea wasn't just poetic metaphor. It reflected the broader Chinese worldview, expressed in texts like the I Ching, Book of Changes, which saw the cosmos as a dance of dynamic forces, yin and yang, in constant motion and balance. Zhuangzi brought this idea down to the level of human experience. Not only the world changes, we do. Our thoughts, desires, and identities, even the very sense of self, are things in transit, against moral and identity fixation. For Zhuangzi, constant transformation is also an antidote to attachment, to fixed ideas about right and wrong, self and other, useful and useless. Once we see that everything changes, our values, beliefs, interpretations, we can loosen rigid judgments and start listening to reality in motion. This ran directly against the spirit of his time. Most philosophical schools sought to establish solid moral systems, stable laws, and enduring ideals. Zhuangzi did the opposite. He proposed detachment from ideals. To freeze the world into absolute rules, he said, was to go against the world's own nature. In that sense, his cosmology of transformation was also a critique of history itself. While kingdoms were building codes and institutions, Zhuangzi offered a vision that was fluid, poetic, and radically free. Stories as images of impermanence. Zhuangzi rarely argues directly. He teaches through fables and images that embody his philosophy. Many of his stories revolve around transformation, not as an abstract idea, but as lived experience. The most famous is his butterfly dream. He dreams he's a butterfly, then wakes up unsure if he's a man who dreamed he was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming he's a man. The point isn't identity. It's that even the line between forms is unstable. Being can change without losing connection to the Tao. Another story tells of a man who loses his axe and suspects his neighbor of stealing it. Suddenly, everything the neighbor does looks suspicious until the man finds the axe in the woods. Then his suspicion disappears. The moral judgment that once seemed so solid completely shifts with new understanding. These stories remind us that our moral and emotional certainties are temporary. They teach us how to live with impermanence, which, in Zhuangzi's turbulent age, was a deep form of wisdom. Death as part of transformation. In Zhuangzi's cosmology, even death loses its weight. It isn't a tragic end, but a natural transition. Like dusk following day, nothing is truly lost. Everything simply changes form. Suffering begins when we resist this. When his wife died, Zhuangzi's disciples were shocked to find him singing instead of mourning. He explained that she had only returned to the rhythm of the Tao. Before birth, she didn't exist, and life and death are just stages of the same great dance. By treating death with calm acceptance, Zhuangzi broke with the solemn attitude of his time. His view of transformation made death part of life's continuous flow, not its opposite. A philosophy written in motion. Zhuangzi didn't act like a system builder. He founded no school, created no doctrine, organized no disciples. And that too was part of his loyalty to transformation. Rather than leave behind a rigid method, he left a movement. His book is a stream of stories, paradoxes, and images that shift as you read them. That literary choice is itself a teaching. Life can't be contained in formulas, only followed with lightness. We live in a world that tells us to chase permanence, to keep status, possessions, youth, identity. Zhuangzi invites us to see something else, a world where everything transforms, where life and death, ideas and forms are parts of one living flow. To recognize that is not resignation, it's freedom. Because the pain we feel from change doesn't come from change itself, but from our refusal to let things change. Impermanence for Zhuangzi isn't a flaw in reality, it is reality. Peace comes not from holding tighter, but from letting go when the time comes. The cycle of forms and the shifting self. Zhuangzi's images bring this vision to life. He writes of fish turning into birds, crooked trees that survive because they're useless, and dreams that merge with waking. Every image reminds us that forms are temporary, and that what we call essence is just a dance of transformations. Believing that we stay the same, that our ideas or identities will last forever, is a gentle but painful illusion. Time moves, bodies age, relationships evolve. The person you are today isn't the same one you'll be tomorrow. And that's not tragedy, it's nature. Accepting that breaks the myth of a fixed self. It frees us from defending yesterday's version of who we are or fearing tomorrow's. We can live more honestly in the present because we're no longer clinging to permanence, death, rebirth, and acceptance. For most people, death is an ending, a rupture. For Zhuangzi, it's just another transformation, a shift from one state to another. Before I was born, I wasn't afraid of not existing, he would ask. So why fear it after death? Birth, life, death is one flow. Death, change, rebirth is its continuation. Accepting that truth frees the heart. To fear death or aging is to resist life itself. Accepting death, Zhuangzi teaches, is to accept the Tao's movement, and in doing so, to find peace. This isn't cold detachment, but deep understanding. Real serenity doesn't come from keeping things the same, but from learning to live gracefully while everything changes. Ideas that live, die, and transform. Not only bodies, but ideas are subject to impermanence. Zhuangzi criticizes those who cling to a single truth as if it were a stone. Every thought, he says, is born from circumstances, produces effects, and then fades, or must be reinvented. When we treat our ideas as eternal walls, we step outside the flow of life and create inner tension. Zhuangzi proposes a different rhythm: conceive, unconceive, reconceive. See that a belief can serve today and dissolve tomorrow. That openness doesn't make us shallow, it makes us alive. The value of an idea isn't in its permanence, but in its usefulness for a world that moves. When we accept that ideas are temporary, we stop fearing change, even in ourselves, flowing with the Tao, peace through non-resistance. The key to Zhuangzi's philosophy is the Tao, the way, the living current of nature. To live according to the Tao is to stop fighting the flow, to stop resisting what happens, to stop clinging to what is already passing. That doesn't mean passivity, it means wise responsiveness, acting with sensitivity to change, adapting without struggle. When life brings loss, redirection, or endings, the one who flows with the Tao accepts and rests in the present moment. Acceptance here isn't weakness, it's freedom. Fighting time, change, or death only drains us. Zhuangzi invites us to dance with impermanence, and through that dance, discover peace. In practice, living with the Tao means observing without rush, letting events unfold in their own time, letting go without bitterness, appreciating things without fearing their loss, adapting without losing center, accepting that form changes while essence remains, living the present without clinging to past or future, knowing that time connects but doesn't imprison. When we see that birth, death, forms and ideas are all in motion, life becomes lighter. Loss becomes transformation, mistakes become learning, change becomes possibility. Not because everything is perfect, but because we stop fighting what is. That is Zhuangzi's antidote to modern anxiety, the tension that comes from wanting to hold on, to control, to last. Peace, he says, isn't found in lasting forever. It's found in living fully while everything flows. In the 4th century BCE, China was not a unified empire. It was a mosaic of competing states, each seeking political, military, and intellectual dominance. Philosophy at that time flourished not as an abstract curiosity, but as an instrument of power. Kings hired thinkers to help manage their kingdoms, justify their decisions, and craft doctrines of rule. Within that competitive environment emerged a curious and sophisticated group of philosophers known as the School of Names, Mingjia. The School of Names wasn't a school in the modern sense, but rather a circle of thinkers fascinated by the relationship between language and reality, the structure of arguments, and the precision of concepts. Instead of asking how should we live, they asked, what does it mean to say that something is what it is? Their focus was logic, definition, and the analysis of words, almost like the precursors of modern philosophy of language. And while many were amazed by their refined reasoning, Zhuangzi laughed. The masters of words and the obsession with categories. Zhuangzi watched those philosophical duels. Masters of speech arguing endlessly, slicing reality into definitions, with amused disbelief. To him, the logicians of the School of Names were playing chess with words, trying to capture life with nets made of language, not realizing that the world had already changed by the time they finished their sentence. He mocks this kind of thinking in many passages, using caricatured characters who debate things like whether a white horse is really a horse, or whether a grain of rice is large or small depending on context. Zhuangzi's criticism wasn't against logic itself, but against the belief that reason alone could contain the universe, as if the world could be captured by names and fixed categories. For him, the obsession with defining correctly was a subtle form of arrogance, the human desire to freeze life into concepts. But life, he reminds us again and again, is fluid, shifting, and paradoxical. The world, as movement, not definition. In a world that's always changing, trying to fix definitions is like trying to hold water in your hands. That's what Zhuangzi saw in the logicians' debates. Brilliant men arguing over the exact meaning of words, while the reality those words described was already something else. Philosophy, he believed, should grow out of direct experience, not verbal battles. That's why he used parables, metaphors, and images instead of rigid definitions. He understood that sometimes you have to speak ambiguously to tell a deeper truth, because what is real doesn't fit into logical boxes. The problem, then, isn't language itself, but our rigid use of it. When we cling to words, we lose touch with what's most alive, the silent movement of things, the Tao. The school of names in the Warring States era. That age of philosophy was driven by a hunger for control, political, moral, and intellectual. Logic and precise speech gave warlords a way to justify their power and persuade rivals. Philosophical debate was often just power struggle disguised as intellect. Zhuangzi saw this clearly. To him, the obsession with being right turned philosophy into a theatre of vanity. Instead of leading people to inner freedom, it trapped them in ego, the need to win arguments, impress others, and be correct. The masters of language looked wise, but in Zhuangzi's eyes they lived inside an invisible cage, the cage of words. So he mocked them. For him, a true sage doesn't impose definitions on the world. He listens to it, in silence. Wisdom that doesn't cling to words. Zhuangzi saw language as necessary, but also deceptive. Names exist for usefulness, he might say, but usefulness changes. A word can guide us today and mislead us tomorrow. That's why the wise don't cling to fixed terms or absolute truths. They look beyond the word to the invisible breath it tries to capture, and then they let it go. This detachment from words, from rigid logic, is the beginning of wisdom. To know that every definition is temporary is to live more lightly, more clearly, and closer to the Tao. It's also an ethical attitude. Once we stop dividing the world into right and wrong, useful and useless, big and small, we stop judging and start perceiving. We stop labeling and start listening. Philosophy or vanity in disguise. Zhuangzi knew that most of those debates served the ego more than truth. Who defines more precisely? Who has the sharper argument? Who wins the duel of reason? He saw how this kind of philosophy produced not wisdom, but showmanship. He portrays these figures comically, trapped in their own logic, arguing while life moves on without them. In doing so, Zhuangzi doesn't reject thinking. He restores humility to thought. Real wisdom, he says, isn't in winning debates, but in recognizing the limits of speech. Beyond that limit lies silence, not ignorance, but openness to the mystery of existence. Imagine trying to catch the wind. You stretch a net, you wait, but the wind passes through, and the net shakes empty. That's how Zhuangzi saw words. Nets made for catching wind. They can gesture toward reality, but never hold it. The trap of fixed definitions. Zhuangzi noticed that many philosophers of his time, especially those obsessed with words and categories, lived inside an invisible trap. They thought that if they could define things perfectly, they'd grasp reality itself. But that effort resists the true nature of life. Once we declare, this is what it is, we stop seeing what's actually happening now. Forms change, contexts shift, and the truth we named melts away. Clinging to words makes us frustrated, because the world keeps moving, and we expect it to match our frozen definitions. The true sage, Zhuangzi said, doesn't dominate language. He listens to it, senses its limits, and trusts what can't be said. This isn't rejection of thought, but humility in speech. The Tao, the way, lies beyond words. The name that can be named is not the eternal name, says Laozi, and Zhuangzi takes that insight further. Wisdom begins where words end. Knowledge beyond words. Zhuangzi distinguishes between two kinds of knowing. The first lives in words. It debates, compares, argues. The second listens. It perceives and acts quietly. The language of the first builds walls. The language of the second opens windows. He once said, "After catching the fish, you forget the net." That's his whole point. Words are tools, not prisons. Once you've understood, you don't need to hold on to the phrasing. The sage knows when to be silent, not out of ignorance, but understanding. He knows that no definition is ever complete, and that truth often lives between words. Practical lessons for life. Accepting the limits of language has deep consequences. First, it dissolves intellectual pride. To believe you've captured ultimate truth in words is to lose the humility to keep learning. Zhuangzi reminds us, human understanding is limited. Knowledge is infinite. To think you own truth is to fall into false security. Second, it encourages openness and adaptability. If words can't hold reality still, we can move more lightly through change. We can think without being trapped by thought. Third, it changes how we relate to the world. We stop seeing things as fixed objects and start seeing them as processes, flows, transformations. We act with less rigidity and more responsiveness, less about control, more about allowing things to be. Zhuangzi calls this an ethics of loose language. Speak when needed. Be silent when needed. Use concepts as tools, not cages. Remember that reality is alive. It doesn't wait for us to name it. The beauty of imperfect language. There's something poetic in Zhuangzi's view. Language fails, and that's what makes it beautiful. He didn't reject speech, only the illusion that it could ever be perfect. That awareness made his writing lighter, more creative, more alive. He used humor, paradox, and story, not to explain everything, but to open something. In a culture obsessed with explanations, Zhuangzi answered with laughter and silence. He showed that the greatest wisdom might begin not in what we say, but in what we finally allow ourselves not to define. Zhuangzi lived in a time when official morality and traditional codes of conduct were breaking down under social pressure, constant wars, human movement, and ethical uncertainty. Society expected a scholar to know the rituals, behave with decorum, fulfill family duties, and climb the social ladder. In most cases, the wise man was seen as a servant of the state, a teacher meant to shape others into useful citizens. But Zhuangzi refused to play that role. He turned down the court's invitation, chose the margins, a simple life, and freedom from prestige. Out of that refusal came his vision of the Zhen Ren, the true person, not a man of titles or offices, but someone who lives differently. In his book, Zhuangzi describes the Zhen Ren as the true man of ancient times, someone who did not rebel against necessity, did not take pride in abundance, and did not plan his affairs. Mai. This figure stands far from the Confucian Zhuangzi, the noble man, who embraces duty, honor, and public service. Zhuangzi's sage doesn't seek fame and doesn't fear obscurity. He isn't defined by his social role or family expectation. He's closer to nature, spontaneous, free, and genuine. He moves at his own rhythm, or sometimes doesn't move at all, not to prove anything, but simply to be. Historically, this marked a deep shift. In a culture that glorified the cultivated scholar as a pillar of society, Zhuangzi proposed that the true sage might actually live outside that structure, not as a failure, but as a higher alternative. He reversed the logic. To be wise is not to climb higher on the ladder, but to step down, to give up rank, dissolve the ego of the expert, and let go of being a predefined individual. Resistance to the scholar's social role. Zhuangzi tells stories of people refusing government positions, retreating to rivers and fields, or living without concern for praise or blame. While the Confucian scholar must teach, lead, and serve, the Zhen Ren serves only life, nature, and the Tao. In an era when thinkers fought for influence, when he who controlled the discourse controlled the state, Zhuangzi offered a silent alternative: the sage who needs to control nothing. By letting go of recognition and ambition, this new kind of wise person reached a deeper freedom, one far greater than any public glory. The Zhen Ren, then, wasn't a literary symbol. It was a philosophical stance, a response to the moral and institutional crisis of the time. When society collapses into noise, the sage doesn't fight for the center. He moves aside and lives from authenticity, spontaneity, and simplicity. The true sage and radical simplicity. One of the Zhen Ren's main traits is radical simplicity, not forced poverty, but natural ease. He eats without luxury, sleeps without anxiety, and doesn't suffer over loss or mistakes. Unlike the scholar obsessed with rituals, books, and reputation, the Zhen Ren uses his life itself as a lesson in freedom. Instead of collecting titles, he invests in silence, detachment, and wu-wei, effortless action. This attitude stood against the intellectual elite of the time. Yet, it's exactly this quiet rebellion that attracted later followers who saw in Zhuangzi not a philosophy of government, but a philosophy of living. After China's unification and the rise of Confucianism as official ideology around the 2nd century BCE, the Zhen Ren continued to appear in Taoist and literary traditions, often translated as the true person or realized being. Over time, the figure took on mystical tones, but its root remained the same: the idea that wisdom doesn't come from social usefulness, but from harmony with oneself and the flow of life. Zhuangzi's image of this alternative sage broke away from the mainstream philosophical tradition. While others built systems of ethics and governance, Zhuangzi offered a sage beyond systems, one who simply lives. Later poets, monks, and rebels embraced this ideal as a symbol of inner freedom, challenging authority and morality. The Zhen Ren also embodies Zhuangzi's criticism of moral and intellectual authority. The Confucian scholar worked for courts, taught rituals, and sought official status, but in doing so, became dependent on the approval of others, trapped by reputation. Zhuangzi flips this idea. Real authority comes from living truthfully, not from holding a title. The true man might look ordinary, invisible even, yet in his humility lies wisdom. This reversal gives dignity to those outside the spotlight, to those who don't crave medals or influence. The sage governs precisely because he doesn't care to govern. He teaches, but not to be admired. He teaches because he lives. In a world obsessed with ambition and rigid codes, Zhuangzi's sage is revolutionary. He's not the strategist, not the moralist, not the successful man. He's the one who lives in harmony with existence, without forcing it. The Zhen Ren represents the purest Taoist ideal, not moral perfection, but oneness with the Tao, the natural way of things. To understand this, we have to let go of the old image of the sage as an intellectual or social figure. Zhuangzi's sage has stepped off the stage. He no longer needs to be seen. He moves as lightly as water and as open as the sky. His wisdom isn't achieved through effort. It blossoms when the desire to control fades. The Zhen Ren doesn't try to change the world. He lives within it, allowing it to change as it must. Simplicity as inner power. For Zhuangzi, a simple life isn't moral virtue, it's clarity. The true sage doesn't decorate his life with excess. He eats what's needed, speaks when needed, and lives without performance. In that simplicity, he finds a kind of freedom that power seekers never know. It's a return to what's essential, a reconciliation with the natural rhythm of life, which is spontaneous, unpredictable, and real. He doesn't fear loss or cling to success. Zhuangzi saw luxury and pride as subtle prisons. The more we try to prove ourselves, the more we depend on how others see us. The Zhen Ren, on the other hand, has nothing to prove, and that alone makes him strong. Nature as the silent teacher. The Zhen Ren lives according to nature, not out of naivety, but wisdom. He knows that life has its own rhythm, and he follows it. He doesn't force things to happen. He listens to their timing. The river doesn't rush, yet it reaches the sea. The tree grows without anxiety, yet it reaches full height. The butterfly doesn't push its wings. They open when it's time. That's how the sage lives. By aligning himself with nature, the Zhen Ren lets go of control. He sees that most human suffering comes from the urge to dominate, to mold others, stop time, make life obey. But control is an illusion. Life slips away like water through the fingers. The flexibility of water. Zhuangzi often used images of fluidity, especially water. Water is soft, adaptable, and light, yet nothing is stronger. It bends around obstacles, yet wears down mountains. It yields, yet transforms. The sage is like water, flexible without losing his essence. Not because he's weak, but because he understands that rigidity is what breaks. Flexibility is what endures. As an old Taoist saying goes, what is hard and strong will die. What is soft and yielding will survive. The Zhen Ren doesn't cling to a fixed path. He watches, listens, and responds. He knows when to be still and when to act, when to withdraw and when to flow, moving through life without anxiety or haste. The emptiness of the sky. Another of Zhuangzi's great metaphors is the sky. The sky is empty, yet everything passes through it. It doesn't resist the clouds or the sun, the rain or the wind. It simply allows. That emptiness isn't nothingness, it's openness. It's the space that holds all things. The sage should become like the sky, vast, receptive, and free of fixed identity. He doesn't say, I am this or I am that. He remains open to whatever arises. Because he's empty, he holds no grudges, clings to no truths, carries no past. He's fully present, and because he isn't full of himself, he can listen, perceive, and move quietly with the Tao. Letting go of control. The human impulse to control is deep. We want life to fit our expectations, to fix what we dislike, to shape reality in our image. But for Zhuangzi, this urge is the root of suffering. The sage doesn't try to bend the world to his will. He knows the world was never meant to obey. True strength isn't domination, it's harmony. Letting go isn't weakness, it's clarity. The Zhen Ren withdraws not out of fear, but out of understanding. He's seen that external power is fragile, and that inner peace needs no display. His silence speaks louder than arguments. His gentleness changes more than commands. Living in peace with the Tao. At his core, the Zhen Ren lives in tune with the Tao, not as a belief, but as a way of being. He knows existence doesn't need to be controlled, only followed. Wisdom isn't something to be achieved. It's something remembered once we stop fighting to be someone. When we drop our roles, titles, and fears, we discover that life, just as it is already enough. The Zhen Ren isn't an ideal to reach. He's a reminder of what we already are when we stop resisting. Zhuangzi's sage is not the one who ascends to palaces, but the one who walks barefoot on the ground. Not the one who chases glory, but the one who finds peace in silence. Not the one who imposes his will, but the one who moves with life, like water, as open as the sky. He isn't driven by pride or recognition. He moves unseen, but everything he touches changes. His presence is subtle, but powerful. His life is simple, but complete. For Zhuangzi, the true sage is, above all, free, because he is no longer trapped by himself. And that freedom is born from detachment, flexibility, and openness. He doesn't control the world. he dances with it. And in that quiet dance, he reveals a wisdom that words can never capture. And if you made it this far, thank you truly. Reflecting on Zhuangzi is more than just understanding an ancient philosophy. It's about opening space within yourself for a new way of living. A lighter way. A more natural, freer way. If this video resonated with you, hit the like button. It really helps spread this message to others who are also trying to understand life on a deeper level. Share it with someone who might need to hear these words. A friend, a family member, or maybe someone who's trying too hard to control the world instead of learning to flow with it. And of course, subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. Here, we keep diving into big ideas, calmly, sincerely, and with presence. Tell me in the comments, what touched you the most about Zhuangzi's idea of the sage? Do you feel more like a river or like a stone? Your reflection might inspire someone else too. And don't leave just yet. There are more videos waiting for you, with more philosophical themes, stories of thinkers who challenge the world, and ideas that might just change the way you see reality. See you in the next video.